Okay, thanks everybody, particularly those who have reintroduced themselves, and welcome to the final session. As I was saying, this is really the second of two, even though it says part three. As before, you'll get a copy of the recording and the slides emailed out afterwards. What we're going to look at this time is build on what we covered in the previous session, look at some of the issues raised by more complex bids, uh, the difference between grants and contracts and what the implications of those are, issues around partnership working and bidding in partnership, packaging projects to appeal to different funders, so without drifting from your own mission and priorities, what you want to do, can you emphasize different aspects in order to appeal to different funders, and when to apply and when you might be better off not applying to that particular source. And that was one of the things we had a request for. So these more complex bids and bids for larger sums of money can be for grants or for contracts. Some of the issues raised by moving it up a gear are the same for both, in that the expectations on you of professionalism and credibility are higher than for small grants, not surprisingly. They do expect a strong focus on how what you want to do will help them to meet their outcomes. This is also good with smaller bids, but again, it goes up a gear. And you may find that you're responding to a commissioning document, particularly from the statutory sector, your local authority or an NHS body or a national government department, where they define the needs rather than you defining them and seeing if they fit the overall priorities of the fund. And from that commissioning document, they may decide to procure services through a contract or offer grant funding opportunities. And that brings me on to the differences between the two. So a grant is a form of donation. It allows the funder flexibility around, for instance, changing the targets and the scope of the grant, moving money around, accepting that sometimes things don't go as planned, so you may not be able to deliver what you said you would. And an imaginative grant funder will view that as a learning experience that you're sharing together, as long as you're open with them. Whereas with a contract, they're buying a service and it's a legal agreement, and there's a lot less flexibility. Grants are often paid up front or in tranches, where the first part might be paid up front. Contracts usually paid in arrears, and if you don't fully achieve the targets, then you may not get the full payments. If you don't achieve the targets at all, fail to deliver, then they are within their rights to sue you. And that's what I mean by a higher legal risk. It doesn't happen very often, but it has been known. On the plus side with contracts, if it's a service that's needed permanently or for a long time, although the contract itself might be only for a year or two, it may be renewed and you can bid again. And if you've performed well, you may well be recontracted. and it becomes a relatively secure source of income, and you don't have to keep reinventing what you do to bid. Whereas with grants on the larger scale, they're more likely to look for innovation, new projects. So that's an instance where sometimes there's an advantage with a contract. You don't usually have to make the case for the need with contracts because they nearly always follow a commissioning document and the commissioners have identified that need themselves. On the downside, if you have identified a need which isn't in the commissioning document, it can't get funded. And the sustainability issue we talked about last time, what happens when this funding ends, is not something that you generally have to address with a contract, because if they think the need is still there, they'll put out another contract. With a grant, if you don't spend all the money they've awarded you, they are within their rights to claw the remainder back because you shouldn't need it. You've been able to buy things more cheaply, for instance. With a contract, they shouldn't do that as long as you have delivered against the targets as agreed, because they've received the service agreed, so they should pay you the price agreed, even if you didn't need as much money as you thought you would. So that's potentially a positive, although, as I've said there, a lot of contract prices are too low for this to happen very often. There's rarely any money left over. So the implications of these, you need to be confident that the targets with a contract are realistic because you are committing to achieving them. And you also need some legal protection for your management committee, because otherwise they could be individually liable if you fail to deliver. So limited company status, for instance, which limits their liability. And although you don't have to prove the need, because they already have done, if you remember last week, we were talking about how related to the issue of need is the issue of demand. Do people want it? And you might want to do your own informal assessment of whether demand is sufficient for you to ensure those targets can be met. If you think of something like tackling isolation, it's a big issue. There will be contracts out there to do that, but by definition, it's a difficult thing to engage people who are isolated. And if the targets aren't realistic, you risk failing to deliver. Another implication is if it's going to be paid in arrears, you'll need some money for the early stages of the project, usually from your reserves. I mentioned that issue about innovation already. Any questions on that before I move on to partnerships? You all okay with that? Good.
Sorry, Sally.
Yeah.
My name is Margaret. How
Hi,
long
Margaret.
should you wait before you get the content of the contract? Before they let you know the content of the contract?
After you've bid, you mean at what stage are you talking about, Margaret?
Well, in our case, they're changing from grant to contract from September.
Right.
And currently, we haven't got a clue of what the contract or what the contract's terms is. So,
Right.
yeah, it's a new thing to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, September is not far away, is it?
No.
That once you're in a contract, if they're going to change the terms, then they do have to give you fair notice. Um, but it's a bit different if it's currently a grant and it's becoming a contract.
Yeah.
Um, So I don't think there is a standard time scale
Okay.
they have to abide by there. Um, once you're in a contract situation, it will be 3 to 6 months. Um, However, it, you have a good case for saying we need to be able to plan, and have you got staff funded under the grant at the moment?
Yes.
Yeah, you've got obligations to them and to the service users. So you do need fair notice of what's going to be in there, whether you can apply at all, or whether they're changing it drastically. It might be that they're changing it partially and you can apply for some of it, but you need to bid in partnership with somebody else and it takes time to set that up. Um, so just being expected to respond to a tender in September isn't really fair on you, is it? Is
No.
it a local authority?
Yes, it is.
I think what I would do is talk to the officers, and if you're just not getting anywhere, then you've got a second line of defence with local authorities, which is your local councillors, and say, oh, this is really difficult for us. It may be that their whole timescale has slipped and actually it won't come in September. That does happen.
Okay. All right.
They might be desperate, running really fast in order to get things in place for September. But actually, if they're not telling you by June for something so important, then either they need to at least give you the broad brush now or put it back, I would say.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, let's think about partnership working. Over to you, a question which you could answer in the chat panel. I think the chat panel would be best, but if that's difficult for you for any reason, unmute yourselves and give me a verbal contribution. What are the advantages of working in partnership for you, for your service users, or for funders, would you say? Better outcomes for people being supported, Tom? Could be. Johanna, reaching a wider audience, being able to deliver more with less, possibly, although it does depend on how you sustain the partnership, doesn't it? Sharing workload and resources, says Luke. Yeah. Sharing skills, says Tendai. Greater reach for beneficiaries, says Caroline. Yeah. Pooled resources again. Opportunity to match fund, says Michelle. So you might have actual cash or in-kind resources to contribute. A wider network of contacts. Yeah, that's a good one, Sangeeta. That coordinated support. So there are fewer gaps in the services and less overlap and duplication as well. Could be increased knowledge and expertise, Tom. Yeah. And increased outreach. Yeah. All, and Martin saying it can help to meet the outcomes. Yeah, for all those other reasons. So potentially very positive. And I had very similar points. That reach to communities who have been excluded or marginalised is more likely to happen. You could have several organisations who are rooted in different communities, have very good reach to them, but need to work together to widen that. And it's more inclusive. And it just means that more people can access the services if those services are linked together. Because if they're not linked together, it relies on the individual service user to know about all of them. But if they are, they only need to find one, don't they? That range of skills and expertise that you've already mentioned, sharing good practice and ideas, a kind of learning culture, less risk of duplication. And in relation to contracts, it may be the only way that small organizations can bid, because sometimes, for instance, they are rooted in a small geographical area. Their constitution may only allow them to work in that area. This is often an issue for registered charities that were set up specifically to serve their locality. But for reasons of economies of scale, a contract may come out which is for a much wider area, and they could only bid in partnership with others who are allowed to work in the wider area. As I've said there, grant funders do really like partnership working, and to a degree partnership bidding as well. We said before that one of the things that puts them off is organisations working in isolation, not fully aware of the context they're working in, not reaching out to others, not being outward facing. And they see it as a very efficient way of working for all those reasons that we've said. Actually, bidding in partnership is a more formal approach than just bidding as yourselves and saying, we have these good working relationships which will benefit the project. And you would be expected to have a partnership agreement setting out the roles and responsibilities of all the partners, how the income will be divided between them and the work, how they'll communicate, and how they'll resolve any disputes. So, yes, Tom, it is a form of contract. It's not, it's usual to say at the beginning of a partnership agreement that it doesn't actually form the legal status of a partnership where you are then responsible for each other's debts, for instance. I missed Caroline's second point about that greater credibility if you partner with a well-known organisation, and that's true. So some of the issues. Often organisations would like an equal partnership, but from the funder's point of view, they then potentially have to deal with lots of different organisations and contacts instead of one, and that is more work for them. And so they may require a lead body, which immediately sets up some inequalities between the partners. And the lead body will often take more of the money because of the increased admin burden. And sometimes you can have resentment between them and the other partners about whether that's a realistic compensation for the extra work and responsibility. It's important to the funders that the partnership won't break down, particularly with contracts where the process is not of great interest to them. It's all about delivering the service. So with contracts, a partnership might be a plus, but only if the relationships are very clearly nailed down and they know that they can deal with the lead body. They take time to set up and time to maintain. And potentially there are those tensions that I mentioned. That's enough of me talking at you. We are going to move you into breakout rooms just to discuss these two questions. And Alison has kindly put them in the chat panel to make sure that you can see them when you're in the breakout rooms. So, a fictional UK online centre is working around digital inclusion, providing access to computers and training in IT skills for those people who lack the resources or confidence or both to get online without help. So if they're approaching funders who are interested in digital inclusion, it's very straightforward. But can they broaden their options and approach other funders with different interests? Who might those be? And how would they need to present what they're doing? Honestly, realistically, to appeal to a wider audience than just the digital inclusion funders. We're going to put you in the breakout rooms for 10 minutes. Would you like a 5-minute comfort break after that before we continue? Just put a yes in the chat panel or give us a wave. Right, several people saying yes, that's fine. So it's just coming up to at 3. So as I know she was in group 3, could group 3 give us 1 or 2 ways they thought this project could be described to appeal to other sources of funding? And you're welcome to speak.
So I think Tom, whoever Tom is, if you look in the chat, I think it's on there, or maybe you can't see it. So I don't know, Tom's had a problem with his mic. I don't know, can you speak now, Tom?
You're muted, Tom.
Is that any better?
Yeah, that's okay.
Is that okay? It was, yeah. For some reason, it really plays up from time to time. Well, I focused on sort of an outcomes-based approach in terms of keywords. So I put down keywords like equality, inclusivity, empowerment. So do you want me to go on, or?
No, that's three good ones. And did you as a group have any thoughts on how that might attract additional funding streams for this project?
Well, I think some will focus on maybe a financial incentive in terms of what those words like that will do in terms of they'll either focus on specifically on how the funding will be used, or maybe the impact that will have on the company itself. Others might be more concerned from a person-centered outcome in terms of the impact that will have on the people themselves. So you might want to link it in with case studies, for example, what sort of legacy it will leave.
Yeah, yes, you're quite right. Some of them will take the approach they want to fund this kind of activity, and others are more interested in activity as a means to an end and open-minded about the activities, because as long as it's going to lead to the ends that they want. Yeah, there is some interference now, so I might need you to mute. So, thank you. Group 2, who is in group 2? Are you up for speaking?
Hello, this is Luke here.
Hi, Luke.
I was designated speaker.
Good man.
So Tori, you want 2 from each question? 2 recommendations?
If you have them, that would be good.
Apologies if I'm repeating anything Tom said, I couldn't hear very well.
Yeah.
So keyword would be social mobility.
Uh-huh.
And also safeguarding.
Yes,
because
point.
With social mobility, bit of a watchword, certainly within our council at the moment. Kind of upskilling equality, safeguarding people staying safe online, also not being subject to scams as well. And then for the appeal, there's a financial incentive. So you invest in these people, invest 100,000, save $1 million for people being subject to scams. We will by doing this, we will ultimately save the community money. We will save the area money by the work we do. And what's the other one?
If I can pick up on that investor save argument.
Yep.
Obviously, it is very important to the public sector when budgets are under pressure, as they have been for years now, and in many ways it just gets worse, doesn't it? I did try and use that argument once with someone from adult social care from the local authority, saying, look at how much this costs every year to the public purse, you know, the cost of not doing this. And she was saying, yeah, but that's the NHS bit of the public purse. It's not my budget. So sometimes they are very narrowly focused on where the savings are likely to be made. Whereas in this case, it should actually save money to the individual client, shouldn't it? Because ironically, it's much cheaper to live largely online, even though the people who need to save money the most are the most likely to be excluded. It may, if it promotes social mobility and people stay in the area, then it may boost the local economy if they're still spending locally. However, there's always the chance that people will move onwards, upwards, and out. So it's not always an easy argument to make, but yeah, very interesting one. I think the safeguarding one is a really good point as well. Yeah. What about group 3? Anything from you?
I don't know if group 1's gone, but I missed. I was just joined it late, so I don't know when you want me to come in on that group to feedback.
Yeah, now please, Martin.
Oh, shall I? Okay, thank you. So I think I had Margaret, Michelle, and Sayara Niam in our group. Was it 2 questions? We had quite a few words, quite productive words coming through. Very good ones. So I'll try and highlight some. We had digital inclusion.
Yeah.
And just about it being confidence building, reduce isolation, Also building it more broadly to include aiding mental health and well-being and promoting new skills, employability skills. I think you just asked for 2, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's when the first group have a very long list, it's a bit hard on the others.
I thought it was interesting just on the building the community idea as integrating it to the wider community and having group sessions. I thought that was nice. And then talked about other activities linked to the service. We didn't really get time to look at how it might appeal to funds for different priorities. We're just thinking of what was their specific remit, what were they interested in prioritising and trying to fit between the two. I don't know how that didn't really get to discuss that one. So.
Yeah, and that's the key approach. Yes, community integration might be delivered by a project like this, depending on how it's delivered. Does it bring people together who wouldn't otherwise meet? Good. Thank you all for that. Well, I had community integration on my list as well. Lifelong learning could be another one, and employability. The others you've mentioned, and potentially that could mean they could look at funders interested in education, funders interested in economic equality, and also funders interested in well-being and cohesion, along the lines that you've all been describing. One issue with this to be aware of is, what will you then have to report on? So if I can take Sangeeta's example while she's still here, it's a MoneyWise project, isn't it? And you could very well make the argument that money worries and not managing money as well as you could is a great source of stress, undermines people's well-being, and is actually a health issue. Would that be a fair thing to say, Sangeeta?
Yeah, definitely. And we're seeing it even more now as we're thinking much more about the mental health of our clients, and especially through lockdown and the impact it's having, and how we change how we can support people.
Huge source of anxiety. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So in theory, at least, you could go after NHS funding, possibly from clinical commissioning group or a national source even, for a money advice project. The issue with that, as I've said on the slide, is that they will be looking for the health gain, and you have to measure that. So you're looking at how stressed people are to begin with. Are they less so by the time you finish working with them? In that example, they might be up for talking to you about how stressed they are at the beginning and the end, but they might not. They might just want to focus on the practical issue of debt management, for instance, and budgeting skills, in which case that fund may not be appropriate. So that is just an example of something to beware with when you are packaging projects, if it moves some way away from what the service users think they're signing up to. Another example would be sports projects, which you identify as tackling obesity. People might not want to self-define as obese. They might just want to play football, even though sport is a great way of tackling that issue. Have many of you actually pursued this? Have you got unusual sources of funding for what you're doing that you'd like to tell us about? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to describe it verbally.
Hi, Sally. I'm Joanne from KDC, and we deal with people with learning disabilities and or autism and community education programs. I work with Kerry. And,
right, yeah.
One of the funds I came across when I was doing the usual trawl was a different way of teaching chemistry for small groups. And so I applied for that, and we got a small pot of funding, only 5,000, to do a pilot project, and it's gone down great with our guys. So we're going to be reapplying for a larger grant of up to 20,000 to keep it going. And it was only kitchen sink science, you know.
Kerry was describing this last week to us,
Yeah.
wasn't she? Yeah, I didn't realise that was the root of it, though, that
Yeah.
there was money available and you thought, oh, we could do that.
Yeah, because our guys, we run the big group as well, which is a lot of self-advocates who come together, and they've always got ideas of things that they want to do, you know, not just like day services. They don't want to be in day services. They want to do photography. They want to do creative writing. They want to do history tours, all these kind of things, you know. So when I'm looking on the funding portal, I just trawl through. It takes a while, but you know, you trawl through, and some of these little gems of funding pop up, and you think, well, yeah, we'll have a go for that, and more often than not, we do get them.
Yeah, and that's an interesting example of how it wasn't what you'd set out to do, but it still met your objectives and appealed to your service users.
Yeah.
Which is really key, isn't it? You don't want to be dragged off track by a funding opportunity, but it's a vehicle, isn't it? And sometimes it gives you ideas that add to what you'd already thought.
Exactly, and it was still education, you know, it was alternative education in chemistry. So, and that appealed to the funder, obviously, because it was successful.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. That's a great example. Well, that is a positive example of thinking outside the box, if you like, prompted by a funder. But flipping that round, the price of funding can be too high when it causes mission drift, takes you away from your original aims and priorities, when the reporting requirements undermine how you work, when it isn't enough money to pay for what you're committing to do, or when the time involved in applying or reporting is too high for you to justify. So taking each of those in turn, with mission drift, you're looking at how well the funder's priorities fit with yours. In Joanne's case, they did, even though it wasn't what she was originally looking for. And also potentially whether their public image fits with the image you want to present, or whether it could undermine that in some way. Can you think of an example of how support from one funder might undermine your mission or your credibility and weaken your support from other funders or stakeholders? And again, if you want to speak or type, either is fine. I have a couple of examples, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Is there anybody whose money you wouldn't take? Funding organisations linked to fraud, Tom? Yeah, that could be very damaging. Have you got anyone in mind? Or gambling organisations or large alcohol corporations, says Joanne. This is particularly an issue if you're tackling those issues. If you're tackling gambling addiction, then for a number of organisations, there's a dilemma about whether to apply for lottery funding, for instance, which is, after all, funded by gambling. It's a moral decision for each organisation, because some will say, well, we ought to get something back from this, and others will say, we don't want to give it any more credibility, we're not touching that. Certain political affiliations, Caroline, yeah, that might actually clash with your values and ethos. And Tenda, it's saying a lot of religious organisations, both Christian and Muslim, have ethical objections to lottery funding and wouldn't touch it. And if some of your members or supporters feel like that, you need to know about that, because it could undermine other sources of support and money. Yeah. Well, my examples were the case a number of years ago at a university that they had a chair established in business ethics funded by British American Tobacco. That was one part of the university. In the medical faculty, they had quite a lot of funding for research from one of the big cancer charities. And when they heard about the British American Tobacco involvement, they pulled their money. So it was very costly, actually. On a much smaller scale, years ago, I used to work for Shelter in one of their regional offices, and we ran housing advice as well as campaigning from an office in a building that was shared with other organisations, and the business upstairs offered us a donation of £100. Now, Shelter is a registered charity. If you're a registered charity and somebody offers you money, you have to have a good reason for refusing it, because charities have an obligation to maximise the resources to support their beneficiaries. It doesn't mean you have to go after all the money that's out there, but if people come to you, you should only turn it down if it would potentially do more harm than good. And we did turn it down, and the Charity Commission okayed that, because the firm upstairs was a firm of bailiffs. And we thought if our service users knew we were funded by bailiffs, they would lose trust in us. So, two very different examples of mission drift with potential costs. With the reporting requirements, some funders are quite heavy on the paperwork. They may require the service users to complete the paperwork, and that could create a barrier to engagement. Much more recently, I was working with learners who'd been homeless, and when we had funding which originated with the Skills Funding Agency, they all had to complete not only enrolment forms but individual learning plans, which they found really quite difficult, however much we adapted them to meet their needs, and that was potentially a barrier. Years before, with the Skills Funding Agency, well, its predecessor, really, FE Funding Council, and then the Learning and Skills Council, at one stage, the enrolment form was a booklet of about 10 pages. And one of the pages was called the Disadvantage Uplift Form, which meant we could get more money for people who ticked one of the boxes on there. And it was a whole series of different categories of disadvantage. And one of them was, were you abused as a child? And we would say to people, look, we've only just met you. We don't need to know that. We haven't budgeted for this uplift. Just tick none of the above and move on. But they were supposed to sign that page as well. And my fear was that just seeing it could be quite traumatic for some people. They wouldn't be expecting that. And even though we weren't asking them to disclose anything, it could be quite damaging. So that's an example of a question I would call intrusive. Right. And Joanne saying ESF funding. Yeah. Yeah, it is really difficult, isn't it? And potentially a barrier to exactly the people that you'd want to engage and the funders would want to benefit, really. But the processes get in the way.
Yeah.
And some of the ESF pots recently, even the small grants, have had targets for how many people are going into work or more formal further or higher education. And again, when I was working with the homeless learners, we decided not to go for that pot, even though the people we were working with were exactly who they wanted to benefit, because I think it was at least 30%. And we knew that our clients were so far from the labour market that 30% was more than we'd ever hit. If it's not enough to cover the delivery costs, this is something to be aware of with contracts in particular, because they may well specify a price. With grants, they'll have a maximum grant usually, but you are defining the price. If you've already got some other funding for the project, or could you use this money to lever in money from elsewhere, so you're only expecting them to part fund, that's fine. But where a contract has been pared down to the bone and it isn't enough to do a good job, you have to decide whether to go for it. And if you are going for it, where does the other money come from? Have you got unrestricted funds in your accounts, which could be used for this, and would that be a good use of them? And you might decide it would. It might be a loss leader because you want to maintain your position and your visibility working that line of work, or you think it will lead on to other opportunities, but it needs to be a clear-eyed decision. And the high investment of time in either in applying or reporting, pretty straightforward, isn't it? A long and complex application for a large sum of money may feel more justifiable than most of the small pots have simpler application processes, but not always. So is it proportionate? Sometimes a long, complex application does actually help you to develop your ideas, and you could then use some of that work for other bids. So even if it's not successful, you wouldn't regard it as wasted time. Sometimes the reporting's so time consuming. ESF is another example of this. You might need an admin post. You might be able to build that into the bid, but you need to be clear about that, before you actually submit. So, deciding whether to apply. Are the fund's aims a good fit for yours? Is there enough funding available to cover your costs? Have you got any alternative ways to fund your priorities? You might have to go for something which isn't what you'd choose if your options are very limited. Years ago, I came across a Baptist church who wanted a minibus. And minibuses have rarely been easy to fund because of all the questions about, well, how are you going to maintain it, run it, garage it, etc. And they had tried all the avenues they could think of and not succeeded. And then they got the option of sponsorship from a local pub. And they were all teetotal. They didn't drink alcohol. They didn't approve of alcohol, but they really wanted the minibus. And they decided that taking that money and having the ring of bells on the side of it was worth it. And they weren't wrong. It was a decision for them. So sometimes it's how many other options have you got, isn't it? Are there reasons for taking a loss leader approach? Would it be better to go for a partnership where you might be able to share some of the costs, as you were all talking about earlier on in this session? Those are the areas that I wanted to cover today. I do have a short recap quiz for you, but were there other funding issues or questions that you wanted to raise before we go on to that? We did put the questions into a poll, but we're not convinced everyone can see it. So we've got them on the slides as well. And if you can't see the poll, just type T for true or F for false in the chat panel. So there are 3 questions. Here's the first. If you don't meet the targets agreed, the penalties are worse with a grant than with a contract. Is that true or false? Lots of F's coming up. It is false. It's the contracts where the penalties you have to worry about. Second question. Partnership bids are usually appealing to grant funders. That is true. And the third one, taking a loss leader approach is never justifiable for a charity. False, says Joanne. Now, I'm not sure whether those T's are from question 2 or question 3. Yeah, never say never, but there has to be a justification for it. There's certainly an argument that if a tender is put out by a public body and you bid to provide that public service, that should not be subsidised by charitable funds. That is not what people make donations for in order to save a public body money. However, you might be subsidising it with charitable funds in order to increase the quality, for instance, above the bare minimum. Or you might have earned income, which you can use however you wish, as long as it's for the benefit of the organisation that you could put into that. The loss leader approach is where you actually go into something knowing you're going to make a loss, but you think it will lead on to better things. So in business, it would be in order to win more business, and ultimately you're going to make a profit rather than a loss. But in the short term, you'd be making a loss. Does that make sense, Jessica and Elise? That's good. So I know I rather kind of skipped over that. Good. So if there are no more questions or points people want to make, we have just over 10 minutes left at the end. Caroline and anyone else who missed the previous session, I'd be happy to put the slides back up and just whip through them in the last 10 minutes. If that would be helpful and you have the time. Yeah. Well, let's do that. If anybody who was here and wants a recap,